Okay, I'll go ahead and get started. Uh, Thank you for coming, everyone. My name is Larry Christopher Bates, and I am a cybersecurity specialist. Uh, so today I'm going to be discussing decolonization through decentralization. And uh, decentralization has many different connotations at this time. So to be specific, I'm going to look at it through the lens of currency and not necessarily uh, one specific currency, but in the context of establishing colonization has used currency as a means of controlling exchange and capital movement. So uh, that's the lens I'll be examining this through. So first, I'll step back and differentiate between a currency that is backed by something versus a fiat currency. So currently, the United States dollar is a fiat currency, which means it was taken off the gold standard in 1971. And as you can see from the chart, the value of the dollar started to plummet dramatically and it hyperinflated due to becoming a fiat currency that was not connected to a specific commodity. Um, Now, that directly affects the global economy uh, due to the United States having between 14 and $15 trillion worth of uh, GDP at any given time. So this looks like various, and the United States dollar is not the only influence. It's more so because of the IMF including US dollars in its basket of currencies as one of the global currencies. All of the global currencies affect global trade, and by proxy, regional values of currencies are affected. So you can see various levels of inflation across the continent from 11% in Liberia all the way up to 249% in Sudan. And as it shows, there are various reasons as to why inflation's occurring in these regions. But colonialism is and imperialism, obviously, in the sense of those two things being intrinsically tied together, uh, has directly influenced these economies to uh, create this type of turmoil to make it easier to exploit these situations and come in as an external player that can provide some sort of monetary or capital support when these countries start having failing economies. So in this context, one of the emerging technologies that has sort of been positioned as something that could change the landscape are digital currencies of various types. So you have SMS currencies, mobile money, you have web-based in-game currency, and you have cryptocurrency. So all of these different types of currencies are uh, viable in their own perspective, from their own perspective concerning their use cases. Um, and this is where cryptocurrencies have sort of dominated the conversation in the past few years, but they're not the only types of digital currencies that exist. Um, and further, you even have some governments starting to create their own digital currencies. So Nigeria has launched a central bank digital currency to limited success for various reasons. Um, this is in the context of cryptocurrency being presented as a way for people to get paid and earn their way out of effectively being uh, the poor or the impoverished in society. But for various reasons, this framing is not really aligned with reality. Um, and the way that it's being presented as if it's a lottery or as if they're stocks, these things are not aligning with what's actually occurring in the market. So I'm trying to establish the context to explain that what's being presented is not actually uh, what actually exists. So, distributed ledger technology has existed long before blockchains. And when we're talking about Bitcoin as a blockchain, uh, it has to be understood that it's an amalgamation of pre-existing technologies, and it's not something that is completely novel or completely new. And further, distributed computing is something that can be used what far beyond just tracking uh, cash deposit or cash movement or transactions between accounts. So examples are the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and Boink and SETI or Stanford Fold at Home, which were uh, initiatives that use distributed computing power to fold protein simulate to simulate folding proteins to cure cancer. So uh, these things actually had novel outputs of the computing power and the way that it was constructed. At the time, people weren't necessarily being paid for it, and they were contributing their computing power for the good of these projects. So in that context, what is being presented now is the notion that if you sell your computing power, then you can take your computer while it's sitting there and turn it into something that can make money where it would normally just be sitting idle. Another example of this was Hashcash, which uh, used uh, payments for access to email to make it so that if you wanted to limit the number of emails coming to your inbox, people would have to pay a small fee so that if they really wanted to get in touch with you, the people who wanted to contact wouldn't mind paying that fee, whereas someone who's just trying to send you spam would not pay that fee. Um, these things all pre-existed Bitcoin, and the issue becomes when people are framing it as if Bitcoin just spawned out of nowhere and that this new technology is going to change everything. It's not actually aligned with the historical framing that led us to this point. Um, so Bitcoin uh, first launched in January of 2009, and it had been in the works for roughly a year. Uh, and in that context, the early stages of blockchain development were limited to a small uh, specialist group of uh, people in between industry and uh, academia who had theoretical frameworks that they were trying to apply in the real world, but only had uh, small adoption in a very dark corner of the internet. And now we have more expanded access to on ramps to cryptocurrency in the form of centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges. And what these exchanges effectively do is allow a person to exchange one cryptocurrency for another, or in some cases, exchange that cryptocurrency for their local currency. And what many people use these exchanges for is arbitrage. Now, the problem with arbitrage is that you don't necessarily need to do arbitrage with cryptocurrency. And many people would be better served executing arbitrage with uh, things that they are familiar with. So, for example, you see people buying and reselling shoes, buying and reselling video games, buying and reselling comic books, cars, anything that can be bought can be resold. In this context, buying and reselling currencies can be something that it profits the individual, but ultimately ends up negatively impacting everyone. So, what I mean is, if people are using cryptocurrency as a means to quote unquote make money, in the context of fiat currencies, as I was alluding to earlier, if there's a need to print more money, everyone's money by proxy becomes less valuable. And when you introduce these mechanisms that encourage people to disproportionately generate profits without generating a new form of service, a new product, or a new widget, then these speculative profits are not real. And ultimately, the colonialist construct has started to introduce these speculative currencies and speculative stocks and speculative investments into uh, other markets to disrupt them. So it floods these markets with speculative investments to then turn it so that these markets are holding only speculative investments, and that market has had all of the actual tangible value extracted through exchanging speculative investments. One of the most relevant, timely examples is Tesla, where if you look at the value of their stock versus their product output, it's completely disproportional, and their value is not wholly speculative, but it's uh, disproportionately found in speculative investment, including their Bitcoin investment, which they just had to offload at a loss. Uh, in that context, um, people will present it as if cryptocurrency in its current state will be this way forever, which is clearly nonsensical in the context of evolving technology. But in the future, there are already current trajectories such as quantum computing, Internet of Things, and supply chain tracking, which move the current speculative investment uh, culture away from the main focus of what this technology is meant for. Uh, if people want to learn more about the decentralized space, I've written a book called "Is Bitcoin Bullshit?" And in this context, it's not about Bitcoin; it's about the history of exchange, the history of currencies, and the history of uh, centralization and decentralization. So these other resources have Udemy and Coursera. I don't believe Coursera. It's either Udemy or Coursera. One of them is free, or maybe both of them. And then all these other resources are free uh, concerning getting access to information. But the issue is, when people are putting information out, they have different agendas concerning whether they're trying to make money, whether they're trying to push a specific currency to get a person invested in that currency, or if they're trying to push a specific company and it's uh, what they're saying is really a cover for the advertisement for that company. Um, and ultimately, there are many people within the cryptocurrency movement who don't understand colonialism and don't understand how currencies have been used against the people who hold the currencies. And this is where, at the end of the day, every sovereign country every sovereign currency within a country is meant to align with the needs and the goals of that country's population. In many cases, a corrupt government makes that impossible. So the local population looks to external currencies to hold their value so that when they work, they don't lose their value that they have accrued when they know that their local currency can't hold that. Colonialism and imperialism have used that imbalance and that need to create a systematic approach to destroying currencies and then using the colonialist currency as a replacement to extract the value from that region while then making it seem as if it's a natural evolution of that currency failing. Some currencies fail organically. A lot of currencies fail because colonialism is intentionally trying to make them fail. And in the case of Bitcoin and Ethereum, these things are being presented as if they are uh, decentralized, agnostic protocols that will be good replacements for someone who maybe live in Zimbabwe and has 249% inflation. Well, it's it looks that way, but when you look at how centralized the tokens are and how centralized the mining farms are, it's not actually as agnostic or decentralized as they're claiming. And by proxy, it's yet another. It was not always this way, but because people did not get involved early on, it's become another form of colonialists to take control of these cryptocurrencies and use them as a way of saving economies that are appearing to be organically falling into hyperinflation when in fact they've been pushed into hyperinflation. So it's in that context that people have to be wary of when we're trying to protect value as a diaspora or as a continent. We can't run to currencies that exist. We can't run to colonialist currencies, especially, and we can't run to currencies that are being presented as something that was meant to save us from the system that they created, because they're the ones that created the problem. All the currency uh, structures and games that were implemented, because we're talking about game theory, we're talking about high level economics, and all of the things that got implemented into these currencies and stock markets have some benefit, but in the end, they were meant to extract value and were not meant to uh, put wealth in the hands of the people. They were meant to put wealth in the hands of individuals or small corporations or investment banks. So when we're told as individuals that we can then come in and use these same means of capital movement to get the same social mobility or economic mobility as these people have, uh, obviously we need to be wary of the narrative around that. But the issue becomes everything is in flux. They have no safe havens anymore. The precious metals are no longer a safe haven. Oil is no longer a safe haven. Uh, Investing in toilet paper or beer is no longer a safe haven. So there is this notion of, if you can create enough of a cultural investment into something, then that becomes its safe haven, which is where you're getting these uh, cults of personality around people like Elon Musk, so that the speculative investment is around the hype around Elon and not their output, because if you examine their output, it doesn't align with the speculation. So in that context, I want to open it up for questions, and if anyone has any comments or anything, please leave them in the chat. Yes, Hattie, I'd already presented. I just finished, and I was opening up for questions. Yes, actually, so I've been talking about the crash for so I have a podcast called Exceptional Randos as well. It's on YouTube and then exceptionalrandos.com. And we've been talking about this crash coming for a while now. And I've labeled it personally like the big nothing. Um, and I'll point to a few things to explain why this crash is coming. So, if anyone has never heard of Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, please look that up immediately. And then you have Martin Shkreli and the pharmaceutical hyperinflation. Um, and then the recalls of Tesla cars, and then, excuse me, Nikola Motors. And I'm not talking about Tesla Motors, not Nikola Tesla, Nikola Motors. It was an electric semi company. Now, Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos operated for roughly 9 years, and they were an organization, or was it a medical tech company that was claiming that they were going to make it so that a drop of blood would be able to give samples or test results on 300 different types of uh, tests. And everyone in the medical industry was saying that's completely impossible. Uh, there's a reason we run batteries the way that they do, and you need at least like um, a vial of blood, not a drop. You need at least a vial, and in some cases, a pint to run that many tests. So Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos were claiming that they had solved the problem and that their tech was viable, and that not only was it viable that they're prototyping this, well, Walgreens hears this and they sign a contract and they start testing this technology. Turns out it was completely fake. They were faking their test results. People's actual medical, like whether it was diabetic or, some sort of disease test, they were having these results faked by Theranos just to keep the company facade going for 9 years. Well, they find out that the results were wrong and they break their deal off. But the company keeps going because of NDAs and not being able to disclose what happened. So Theranos is able to keep the facade going for, I think, a couple more years after the Walgreen failure. So this is like this company is faking its results for 10 years and getting I think $9 billion valuation and continuing to get investment this whole time while it's faking the results. Well, now she just got found guilty of fraud, and the story ends with her going to prison. So it's like At the same time, while she ultimately got found guilty, 9 years of Theranos not getting checked in the markets is everyone having to compete with this company's narrative defining the market, and in the process, speculative investment making profit around this company. So all the people who made money, they don't actually care whether Theranos delivers or not because they got in and got their money. Now, how does this apply to African economies? You've seen the investment in Africa increase 1,000% in the last 6 years, literally 1,000%. What they're doing is trying to take this model and apply it to Africa and turn these African companies into unicorns so they can go and extract value and then leave the African company behind to make it look like the African company is the one that tricked everybody. And this is where there is bad investment money that you don't want to take. I've had people when I was working in different startups, they were offering way more money than where I'm like, okay, there's something attached to this, and I don't want to actually have this much money hanging over my head. And then you realize it's because they're using these companies to create speculative investment uh, channels and then turning around, exploiting those channels, and then leaving the company to take the reputational hit while they take off with the money. Um, and then economic tools. So what I've found is like the best use of economic tool is finding economic disparities that can make it so that the person in one position has a surplus that's needed elsewhere. So like microloans are a great example where like if I have like $20 that is like sitting there, if I send that $20 to a different economy, that can actually be a significant sum of investment for somebody. Like you don't need a blockchain to necessarily do that. Kiva has been a great organization and I've tested it just to see like they take fee. The issue is the fees that Kiva takes could be reduced with something like a blockchain. It doesn't have to be a blockchain necessarily, but a blockchain could reduce the fee. So if I loan somebody $20, $25, Kiva takes $3 on top of that. So it costs $28 altogether. Or it costs me $3 to loan somebody $25. That's entirely too much. Um, so this is like things like GoFundMe or Kiva are tools that if somebody's in a disparate economy, they can use those to leverage it from people who are somewhere else who have a surplus that like to them $20 is nothing, but you send that to somewhere else and that's like they could start a small business with like not like it's not like they can rent something. It's like, oh, they can get enough uh textile to start weaving or something. They can start making their uh get their first round of product set with $20. Um let's see. Yes, it's definitely neoliberal, colonial language that is double speak. It's not decentralized, it's more centralized than previous. And then you look at the centralization of the currencies, and it's like if there was like the 1% with US dollars, it's like the 0.001% with cryptocurrency as far as how much more concentrated it is. It's not decentralized whatsoever. Whether we're talking about the currency or the networks. Yes, and the no space is immune from the crash, as far as I can tell. And the big issue is the chip shortage. So, because there's a silicon shortage and by proxy a shortage of microchips, every digital industry is being affected by that. Anything that has anything to do with digital, and this, like at this point, everything does. So, like the cars, automobile companies are the ones that are actually at the front of the line concerning microchip purchases. So when we're talking about the global economy, everything that has any sort of digital impact or footprint is going to be affected by this, especially things like cryptocurrency. So like yes, smaller, more agile organizations are the answer. And it's like not necessarily Google is too big at this point. And if you look at organizations like Lenovo specifically, they are a better example of what decentralization looks like within a corporate structure. Or Ford's fairly decentralized, actually. Um, the issue becomes how much is top down and how much is bottom up concerning mandates. And the usually Google's mandates are very top down, whereas somewhere like Lenovo has a more middle out or bottom up mandate, like because they are more reactive based on the input of the uh, scientists on the ground. And that's where more agile, like even it's whether it's a social movement or a movement towards implementing a new technology, the more decentralized that thing becomes, the less likely it is to fail because single points of failure become the problem. And that's where Google itself has created a single point of failure within its own infrastructure in too many places concerning its front facing interaction with the people. So like for example, YouTube is the central point of Google interacting on the video face or uh, video storage and putting out content. So if that starts to go away uh, as being like the mode or what's in style, then Google will have to divest from YouTube or and start investing in some other platform to ensure that it still has presence in that particular area. And that's again, we have gone past too big to fail into the point where uh, things need to be decentralized for the sake of survival, not just for the sake of decentralization. And I think many people in the neoliberal space are the ones that like push this idea that like everything needs to be decentralized for the sake of decentralization, when in reality it's a tool, it's a scale. Since sometimes you need to centralize, sometimes you need to decentralize. And right now the problem is that our decision making and capital flow is too concentrated, and you have people like I keep going back to Elon Musk because he has too much influence and too much power concentrated in an individual. Like democracy was meant specifically to reduce that concentration of power within individuals, and it was originally in the context of obviously the monarchies and oligarchies. We've had that same power imbalance reintroduced into our societies now in the form of oligarch robber barons, or the people that lead these companies are the ones that now hold that imbalance of power. And that's kind of where that imbalance of power becomes a central point of failure for societies. And it's like, it's not just that we don't want individuals holding that much power, it's that society can fail when that if those people start to make poor decisions. And we can see with Elon already, Tesla has lost 60% of the value on its Bitcoin investments. The stock's tanking. The Twitter deal has gone bad because this one person is making poor decisions and the concentration of power is too high. And once that person, if they make great decisions, that's perfect. But once that individual starts making poor decisions, everything fails because the concentration of power is too high. So that's again where the diaspora and Black like unity can't suffer from the same concentrations of power. And I love that this uh forum it has so many intellectuals and so many people speaking from that from different perspectives, but that speaks to the notion of like it can't just be based around one person or one perspective. Otherwise, it's dead on arrival. I'm gonna read some of the comments before I send it. So there is the union. The union observation is perfect in that one of the reasons Ford is persisting is because of the union and its ability to push back against uh, exploitative practices by the corporation, um, but also it works for the safety of the worker, and that's something that when you have a corporation or an organization that is only beholden to the shareholder, they don't actually care about the worker on the ground because that worker is effectively a number to them. So that's where it is on the union to turn those numbers into humans and make sure that those humans are protected, which is why, you know, I know personally my father worked at Ford and he was the president of the local union. So I understand um, the importance of unions, but I've also seen that unions can suffer from the same problems of centralization. So I think this is where uh, it's on organizations to know. I mean, this is obviously a utopian vision, but it's more so if organizations are more cognizant of understanding that the reason there are boards versus an executive is that there needs to be some sort of balance of power, and that's where an executive runs the organization, but a board balances the executive just to ensure that a single person isn't dominating the trajectory of that organization in a problematic way, and that's sometimes boards can become problematic. So I think it's like with the understanding that there's always going to be special interests and special interest groups, the more transparent about those interests people are, the easier it is to determine when the interests are not aligned. And as long as interests are aligned, it doesn't necessarily matter if they're the same interests. Um, that's where we're getting to a point where the notion of things in the market being presented as if they are solving a problem is not actually what's happening. Things are being put into the market to make money, and they are given the appearance of solving a problem to be sold to make that money. It doesn't always solve the problem, and more often than not now, it doesn't work the way it's claimed to work. So in this context, buying and reselling for profit or uh, selling broken things knowingly or selling empty vaporware like Nikola Motors did. Um, oh, just to get back, Nikola Motors, they claimed that they were going to create an electric semi, complete vaporware, all lies, never had anything that was working. They would take it to the top of a hill, and the commercials were videos of the semi rolling down the hill. These things were able to get through because nobody was checking and nobody cared to check. As long as you make your money, it doesn't matter if the thing is real or not in this particular environment. So, moving away from that exploitative culture is, I think, going to be the only thing that uh, allows a unity movement to occur because otherwise, uh, that profit motive will end the unity movement itself. Somebody will come in and try to make money off of it somehow. Yeah, and I see there was a discussion about Elon Musk almost starting a war in Bolivia over lithium. And let's remember this guy was claiming he was far left socialist about 2 years ago, and now he's a firm Republican. That while he is openly in a disagreement with Donald Trump, he is clearly now saying he is a right winger and uh, supporting the right of racists to be heard on social media, so for the sake of free speech. So again, this is a person who was pretending to be a liberal to effectively uh, make it seem as if social justice was something you could buy by purchasing his car, undermining social movements yet again. And this is the same. It's the same thing with putting Che Guevara on a T-shirt and then selling that T-shirt for $25. Like capitalism, and I've been calling it exploitism, are very, very good at taking social movements and figuring out how to monetize and turn them into something that undermines the actual social movement. Uh, so in that context, yeah, somebody, you know, like I don't know if people have heard, oh, Elon's dad owned an emerald mine. Well, he didn't actually even own an emerald mine. His dad lied about that yet again. So he was selling investment in an emerald mine that didn't exist. This this whole investment into vaporware is something that these people have been doing for a very, very long time. It's not something that started with Elizabeth Holmes, and it probably goes back even further than I can imagine. Um, but when you find out that Elon's dad didn't even own an emerald mine, but was selling investment in a fake emerald mine, I mean, where do you think Elon gets it from? So that's kind of, again, we can't have African or Black people reproducing these same strategies, uh, because ultimately the hot potato is going to end in somebody's hands, and then they're going to be like, well, these Black people are the ones that did this, and then all of that gets blamed on the last people doing it, as if Black people killed the economy. And that's something you see in different organizations. The only time they'll allow Black leadership is when they know that the ship is sinking, so that then they can come in and blame that sinking ship on the Black leadership. And I see it happening with investment now, so that once all of the speculative investment starts drying up because it was never actually producing anything of value, well, once we started investing in African companies, we just couldn't produce anything, even though they haven't actually been producing anything for the last 30 years. So that's where you need that whole context of why they're presenting Bitcoin and Ethereum as this like saving technology, when in reality it's just to come extract everybody's currency and then get them dependent upon that network. In the process, if they get an African company to then come in and become the next Google, then that's just the way that they're going to mine the bio data, because ultimately, if you look at where Google is, they've made bio data more valuable than gold ultimately. Sure, yeah, I'll share links. Yeah, if there's any more questions, please post them in the chat. Yeah, I guess if there's no more questions, uh, I'm glad to have everyone that came today, and I sincerely appreciate your time. Let's see. Well, okay, so even down to the idea of like a lot of these places have infrastructure problems. So like what server they need, it's like, well, do they have electricity? Do they have electricity that's going to work for 24 hours first? Um, so that's where to me, like the last mile problem is one that the crypto space rarely ever has an actual solution for, and one they rarely ever address because if you go to Nigeria, if you go to Kenya, like a lot of these, if you go to India, a lot of these places have electricity problems where they like every day you won't have like constant electricity for the 24 hours. So if the server is local, that's a problem. That's not to say that they can't solve that problem, but you have bigger problems than what servers they should be using, which is why like presenting the idea that these people can be focused on like cryptocurrency is completely disconnected from the realities of them every day having to worry about like keeping your refrigerator cold or staying cool in the heat. And especially like when we're talking about people who have mobile money access in the first place, mobile money is free for like in many cases it's free for transactions that are under like $20 USD. So if somebody's like not really rich and they only transact a little bit every day, mobile money is already serving them. They don't really need a crypto server locally anyway. So I guess when it concerns like adding servers for, here's another issue. When we're talking about like computing, one of the big problems that is being presented by this rhetoric is the notion of like adding hardware inefficiency and hardware uh like processing as a means of security. That's a terrible idea. It's a terrible notion. It's completely out of line with computer science. It's completely out of line with physics because we're trying to make everything more energy efficient. And then you have these people saying, oh, we'll increase the amount of energy it takes to secure a transaction to make it more secure. That's complete nonsense. So, like, we should be moving towards lighter computing that doesn't even need necessarily servers because, like, for example, a Google Sheet, it exists on a server somewhere, but the people using it don't need to have a server because it exists in a cloud on a server somewhere else. So when we're talking about like cloud computing, have been so many advances made in cloud computing that then reintroducing unnecessarily complex hardware computing into that process is actually like a really ridiculous proposition, and that the people in the cryptocurrency space who are suggesting it are like really out of line with reality when they're saying that. And it's like again, hardware computing has gotten more energy efficient because that's what it's meant to. It's not. It's part of the needs of improving computing to make it more energy efficient, because if you get better computing, but you don't improve the energy efficiency with it, then your actual ability to use that is compromised because you don't have enough power. And I don't really think a lot of people understand, like, if you have a really powerful computer, that's because it's actually consuming a lot of energy. So, like, for example, um, the current uh, the current generation of GPUs consume about 1,000 watts at the highest, and some of them at the lowest are like 40 watts. So if you're using uh, a GPU that only consumes 40 watts, you can't do the same thing that a GPU that consumes 1,000 watts can do. However, through the beauty of cloud computing, I can take someone else's computer remotely and get that same processing and get the output on my computer. It may be a little bit downgraded because of the transmission and the quality reduction that comes with, like, transmitting that signal on a line, but I can still take my 40-watt GPU and borrow someone else's power instead of having to build that same thing locally to do it. And that is what computing has moved towards, concerning the capacity to actually execute uh, algorithms. So it's like, for example, Pixar Entertainment, when they when we had COVID, they had to have their people able to remotely render objects. And when we're talking about objects that somebody can't render from their home computer, well, they can remotely use their rendering farm. Even though they're not in the building, they have a farm of a ton of machines that you have to get a certain VPN login access to, that if I'm at home, I can still access those machines. That's way more efficient as a model than trying to then outfit every individual at home who works for Pixar uh, to be able to produce the final output. The same thing with computing, where it gets to a point where sometimes it is better to concentrate all of the servers in one place and allow everybody to access them remotely. And then sometimes it makes sense to have everyone remotely be the servers. And the real situation when the latter makes sense is when the computing costs are low, so that each individual computing node can contribute and not worry about being overpowered by someone else. And that's where Bitcoin mining, Ethereum mining, well, almost no longer, but these things are not equivalent, so that if you're competing with a mining farm as an individual, you're not going to have the same capacity to make money, but they're presenting it as if, oh, this individual mining on their home computer is going to get as rich as the person as the mining farm somehow, through luck or through a lottery, and that's just not how it works. Which is why moving away from the hardware makes sense, because the hardware cost really only benefits uh, organizations that have the capital to purchase a ton of hardware. Yeah, if there are any more questions. All right, if there were no more questions, then I'll go ahead and end the session. And thank you everyone for coming. And I hope the information was useful, and I hope you all have a fantastic weekend.